Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of SUGTalks. I'm Craig Dale, your host, and together with our special guests we'll take a deep dive into the topics, challenges and opportunities facing SAP users today. Please make sure you subscribe so you never miss another episode. I'm delighted to be joined today by Samantha Rockey, Associate Fellow at Said Business School at the University of Oxford, co-founder of Thomson Harrison, and also co-author of The Social Brain, The Psychology of Successful Groups, which will be, I think, the main topic of our conversation today. So welcome, Samantha.
Thank you very much, Craig.
And in today's episode, we are going to explore how our social brain influences the dynamics of communities, what makes a community truly thrive. And I think from my perspective, I'm definitely interested in this on multiple fronts, if you like, but one from an organisation perspective of how that affects organisations and our member organisations too, but also from the fact that, UK&I is a community of SAP users, SAP developers, SAP themselves, SAP partners, and it really does interest me, this topic. So I'm really looking forward to chatting to you, Samantha. And just before we get into that, quick icebreaker question. And I thought I'd ask is, if you could live anywhere in the world for a year, where would you choose and why? Now, while you think about that for just a short time, I don't know whether you watched Death in Paradise, but I reflect back on this on a number of times, but I think I could just live in the inspector's shack for a year, just looking out at sea for that time.
Craig, that's a fantastic question. And if you give me a year, do I take my family with me? Am I going solo traveler?
Ooh, no, there's a question. That is completely up to you. I don't want to cause any domestics.
Well, I think I would have to say somewhere in Italy. I think we've enjoyed it so much as a family every time we've gone on holiday, and I can imagine also being a solo traveler. So I think it would tick both boxes if I had to choose. And if I can even be more specific, perhaps it would be Puglia in Italy. Oh. I think the Trulli house is a wonder of architecture, and I think there's nothing that would stop one just having the most joyous year.
Fantastic. Oh, that's amazing. I'll write that down as well. So I've got that for the future. Oh, well, thank you for that, Samantha. And just to kick us off on our main topic, I just thought it would be good if you could share your background with our listeners.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually was kind of a new arrival to the UK. I've been here for about 10 years. And prior to that, I was in South Africa. I was born and bred in Joburg, South Africa, and then spent a bit of time in Zurich. The reason I mention that is I've actually had a career in three parts, and each part has been in a slightly different location. So I began my life in terms of career in South Africa in the first post-apartheid government. And this really influenced some aspects of the book, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I then joined a company that started at the tip of Africa, actually, and that grew to be the second biggest brewing company in the world, called SAB Miller. And as part of that organization, I spent some time in Switzerland, in Zurich, or a small village actually near Zurich called Zug, and then moved to the UK. We were bought out in 2016 by AB InBev in the UK's largest corporate acquisition. And then I began my own company. I'm a co-founder of a company called Thomson Harrison, and have spent the last 5 or 6 years leading my own organization. So this sort of three-part career, in a sense, in three different places, I feel has given me a perspective that hopefully we'll get an opportunity to talk about in the book, is that no matter where you go in the world, no matter what organization you work in, there are some aspects of it that are absolutely consistent to every human experience. So I do feel that I've been very lucky, actually, to have worked in 3 different kinds of companies and organizations to have given me this perspective. So that's a little bit about my background. And of course, my real passion has always been in the world of leadership and organizational development, although I started off as a development planner, which is a completely different focus. But I found myself really interested less in the area of policy, actually, and much more in what was going on behind the scenes. Why did some groups thrive? Why did some groups just fall apart? What was really going on from a culture perspective?
Well, fantastic, and thank you for that. And I would concur with exactly everything you were saying there, because I work with we're the UK and Ireland SAP user group. I work with other user groups from around the world, and their challenges are the same as ours. Their structures are not exactly the same, however, but the communities, the groups, and what works and what doesn't, in the main, is very, very similar. And I suppose people are the same, and it's people that are at the root of everything and at the centre of everything. And so just moving on to the book now, for the benefit of those people who perhaps haven't read the book or listened to the book or even heard of The Social Brain, could you provide a short overview of the book and what it's about, please?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the book brings together 3 perspectives. So it brings the perspective of an evolutionary psychologist called Professor Robin Dunbar, who's an emeritus professor at Magdalen College at the University of Oxford. And he spent many years researching what makes us human, and also what our evolutionary kind of background, the gifts and constraints that they've given us, especially when we're working in small groups. My co-author Tracy has always spent time in education. She has spent time at the business school focusing on leadership development, and I've come from a practitioner point of view. So I'm no scientist, absolutely a practitioner. And we've brought together to really look at what makes a group successful. How can a group thrive? What makes a group, better than the sum of its parts? So we look at group dynamics, we look at group size. So, for example, there are very real constraints that we have that Robin spent a lot of his time researching. What are the constraints in terms of how we think about the design of groups, for example? When we think of group size, what are the practical insights that you can bring to the way that you think about putting your group together? We spoke to over 50 leaders from a range of different organizations, whether it was from the military, orchestras, people who are leading museums, who are leading design, companies. What are the consistent threads that appear everywhere, and how can we bring that to life in the teams that we lead and manage? So the book really provides, I guess, a kind of deep dive from 3 different worldviews and bring it together. And of course, Robin focuses on what perhaps hasn't changed over our evolutionary history. Tracy and I have focused on what can change. And we think that that is the sort of magic that we've brought to the book.
Oh, thank you very much. And you mentioned when you were talking about post-apartheid South Africa that did influence some of what you've been creating within the book and development of the book. So how did your past experiences influence that?
Well, I think that certainly what I noticed, and of course I didn't have the language for it at the time because we hadn't come across the work of Robin Dunbar, but intuitively it was clear that there were some moments where groups really worked well together, even though there was perhaps a difficult history. And the example I use in the book is actually the setting up of a choir in a department that I worked for. And that coming together and singing together actually is a very powerful mechanism of creating connectivity. And of course, we don't often stumble across people singing together in organizations, but increasingly the research shows us that there's a really profound effect. So whilst I didn't have the language, I did observe some patterns. The other pattern that I have really been struck by, actually, and this is something S.A.B. Miller did extremely well, was we always had a canteen. No matter where you were in the world, there was an opportunity for people to come together and eat together. And I know it's sort of a mad pendulum effect, is that organizations swing from, everybody having to eat a sandwich at their desk because there's no shared place for community eating, through to suddenly organizations recognizing that eating together has a really important impact. But of course, what I've observed is that where people have an opportunity to break bread together, not in a forced way, but in a way where they genuinely are interested to come together, it's a break from the desk, the impact on performance is huge. Mm-hmm. The well-being research certainly tells us that where people have opportunities for this kind of connection, there is a pull-through. We are living through a mental health crisis. We're, living through a complete epidemic of loneliness. And of course, a way of disrupting that actually is getting people to have conversation together. There's a kind of endorphin release for at least 30 minutes while you're eating together. And that creates a feeling of well-being to your fellow diner. And we're not talking about, Michelin star prepared meals. We're talking about literally going together and having whatever your preferred lunch is. But there's so many positive benefits. It sounds so simple. And as I say it, I'm always conscious of the fact that people be like, yeah, but that seems the most obvious thing to do. But yet many, many organizations don't do it. Their employees just don't have an opportunity to do it. So that was something I noticed, and where people did that, where we had that culture, we really saw an upswing in both connection and in performance.
Oh, thank you. And yes, a very interesting aspect, the choir, I thought was quite fascinating. And mind you, I've seen some of our teams sing a karaoke. I'm not sure the choir is the right way for us to go. But that coming together and that creating of opportunities to come together is fascinating. And because I can relate that back to what we do as a user community, bringing our members together in smaller groups for what we call our special interest groups. Then we'll have larger kind of events, and then we'll have our annual conference, which is our largest event. And when I look at them and how different they each are, and then what fascinated me was the talk around the Dunbar number. And please do elaborate on that for me, because I found that fascinating. I also found it so true.
Well, Craig, you've touched on absolutely the heart of really, I guess, what our book, what we talk about in our book. There's a fantastic quote, I don't know if you remember it, which is that we can really only be ourselves in small groups. We can only be seen when we're in groups of a number that allows somebody else to know and recognize us. And that's absolutely true for every single human being. I mean, we have some definite constraints as humans. And we talk about 4 kind of constraints in our book. The first is that we are always drawn to be part of small groups, whether we like it or not. We need that. It's part of our kind of the way that we work. The second is that we have a neocortex that is only so big, which means that we can only really have about 150 relationships at any given time. And when I say relationships, I'm talking meaningful relationships where you might know something about the person, you might have, you have a connection with them that would give you a bit more insight. And this means that we're swapping out people as we work more closely with some people, less closely with others. People have to drop in and out. And this is one of the factors of the Dunbar number that has been so profound, is that we can't maintain huge numbers of relationships. It's impossible, really. But recognizing that, having a consciousness about that, then gives us the ability to be much more mindful about who you are in relationship with. And 60% of our social time is spent with about 15 people. So we really are very closely connected to quite a small number of people, actually. The other constraint is the fact that we are, in a sense, I don't want to use the word victim, but we are in response to a hormonal soup. So every time you walk into a group, there's a kind of hormonal response. When you feel welcomed in, you kind of feel a sense of connection. When you feel excluded, you would have a hormonal response to this. And this is something that's happening below the surface. We're not always conscious of it. In fact, hardly ever are we really conscious of it, but it's happening all the time, and it impacts on how we experience the world. And then, of course, the fourth constraint, which is just how much time we have in a day. How much time can we spend? And I think that we are really, as humans, held capture to perhaps spending the wrong amount of time with the wrong people, or we don't spend enough time with people who we really should be spending time with. These are the trade-offs that each of us have to be thinking about on the daily. And we talk a lot about numbers in our book, because actually it's the silent aspect of when we think about groups. It's just not really something that is factored in. Mm-hmm. And we've got so many examples of this, and you yourself would be aware of the impact that something like Teams in the pandemic had on people's relationships. People just being included in meetings endlessly, but yet doing other work while simultaneously being so-called online, also really not being able to hear every voice in every meeting. The kind of time wastage, if you had to convert that into pounds and pence, would be enormous. So there really is something absolutely critical about the numbers, both in terms of performance and impact.
Thank you, Samantha. That's fascinating.
We know our community, but we don't know yours yet. Why not share the benefits of your UK&I sub membership with those who don't know about us? The UK&I sub referral scheme rewards you for helping to grow and develop our community. You can check out the link in the description to find out more about how you can get involved. Terms and conditions apply. We hope you enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Well, one of the things within our community that's crucial is networking, and we put on networking workshops, especially at our annual conference, to help our members and provide them with a bit more confidence perhaps in getting the most out of networking at the event. And one of the parts of the book that I was quite fascinated with was the discussion around, I think it was the rule of 4 in conversations, that to have a meaningful conversation, the maximum amount of people in that conversation is 4. And perhaps could you talk a little bit about that for me, please?
Yeah, I would love to, because I think that it's one of those things that now you've said it and people would have heard that, is that you can never unsee it again. Because every dinner party you'll go to, every cocktail party, what you'll notice is that as soon as the group is larger than 4, people split up into subgroups. We just don't have the mentalizing capability to hold a conversation with more than 4 people. It is absolutely fascinating. And how to design a perfect dinner party, how to design perfect connections. You will notice in your own work that when you're asking people or inviting people to have a conversation about a serious topic, is putting them in a larger group, is that there will always be people at the edge who just are not contributing. As soon as you've got 4 people, there's a kind of equal share of voice. You don't need a leader. Everybody feels an opportunity to come in. And there's also something about being able to hear literally every voice. When you have a bigger group, it's really difficult for some people to even hear. People with lighter voices might not be as easily heard just because of the tone of their voice. So there's something absolutely kind of fundamental about this conversational 4. So my recommendation, and this comes from Robin's research, is that if you want to design a fantastic dinner party, 4 or 8 is a brilliant number. 6 is a number which will always divide into 2 3s, and the most common restaurant booking number is 4 for a reason.
Very interesting. Thank you. And I suppose, from that, so if I kind of reflect that back into how we work perhaps as a board, or even when we organise roundtable meetings and discussions, we will generally be looking for a maximum of 20 people, say, but we will have a chair for that. So somebody who can facilitate and hopefully manage the conversation to ensure everybody has a voice. As I suppose, as part of what you're saying, is there's a risk there that the conversation could be dominated by the perhaps louder or even more talkative people.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think that the danger with a group of 20, of course, is, as you say, there'll always be a couple of people who feel very comfortable putting their point of view forward, whereas there will be a number of people who perhaps need more time to reflect and think about their point of view. In those circumstances, I never shy away from putting people in much smaller groups to have a different kind of more intimate conversation and then bring that back into the bigger group. And I think we really do have to account for different personality styles as well. We work a lot with people who are perhaps on the more reflective side, who feel that they would rather kind of think a little bit about the question being asked and perhaps are more interested in providing a thoughtful point of view, whereas other people are really happy to just be in the kind of fray, throwing out ideas without necessarily feeling judged or kind of feeling that they need to have something that's well formulated. So breaking up in small groups and giving people time to have a smaller conversation, I think really benefits actually everybody, and it benefits the group process. Just a caution, Craig, is that sometimes it feels that, certainly in the work that we do, that people feel obliged to include people because it's the right thing to do, but without necessarily being absolutely clear about what everybody's contribution should be. And there's a really wonderful intent in that. It's the idea that everybody needs to be part of something. But in fact, it might have the opposite effect, which is that people who've been invited to a meeting or to a conversation, but they never really get an opportunity to contribute, it actually diminishes their engagement and the interest. So how we design meetings, I think, is one of the bigger questions that organizations need to be asking, both in terms of time, how we spend our time, but also in terms of efficiency. What is going to get us to the best outcome? Mm-hmm. What could that look like? And then really being super clear about what that is. So I think there's a design challenge here that goes beyond a kind of clumsy invitation to everybody.
That's very interesting. And that, when we kind of look at that, and fascinating as it is around groups, communication, and groups working together well, how do you bring that back from an organisational perspective? How does that relate to perhaps structures of organisations?
Yeah, well, we've written in the book, we've called it team size to task. So beginning with the task in mind, and then thinking about how to design the team to optimally deliver this. And there's a piece in the book which I think your audience would be very interested in, which is around communities of practice. What is a good number for a community of practice to have an absolute free flow of information and ideas, to have the richness of innovation that comes from a community of practice, but at the same time to encourage everyone to contribute? What is the number for that? What is the number when you want to come up with something that might be a really difficult decision? Why is 12 to 15 such a good number if you want to noodle through a very challenging question? Why is 5 an excellent number for a crisis meeting? If you need to do something at speed, 5 is a brilliant number. So how you think about the numbers in an organization, I think, is an important component of design and of thinking about how meetings are structured. But beyond that, of course, there are also aspects from a culture point of view that you want to have in place. So, how do you build psychological safety, that everybody feels that they can really contribute equally? What are those components? What do they look like? And we speak about all of those issues and challenges in our book. And yeah, it's something that we've been thinking about for a very long time, actually. What does an ideal structure look like to arrive at the outcome you're seeking to achieve?
Thank you. And just going back to something you mentioned, the culture word there, and one of the elements that I kind of picked up a quote from the book was that kind of the right environment is as important, if not more important, as the right mission statement. And what does that mean?
Well, Craig, we sort of, through the research that we've done over many years and also bringing together the conversations that we've had, we've arrived at something called the Thrive model. And we've used the word thrive very deliberately because, I mean, it feels like we're in a moment where people are not thriving always. So how can organizations be much more mindful about creating a thriving culture? And there's 6 components to this Thrive model. And each of those components is a contributor to performance, impact, and innovation. So just maybe talk about culture for a moment, which is one of the 6 elements, is that, something as simple as rituals and traditions and practices and ways of working that feel consistent to people create a very containing space. And I like to use, once again, a very simple example. It's centered around food again, if that's okay. But, it's something like bringing birthday cake to the office, something about the ritual of a Monday morning. During COVID, so many people did things like Monday morning teas where they would meet on Teams and have a cup of tea together. Just these rituals that give people a moment in a week to really say, actually, this is what we do in our organization, because this is the culture we're trying to cultivate. And if it's a nurturing culture, doing things like that creates that sense of nurturing. If it's a high performance culture, having regular one-on-one meetings or regular conversations about performance, that indicates that this is a high performance culture. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's more about what is the culture you're trying to develop and what are the rituals, traditions, practices, ways of working that will really buoy that culture up. What are the things you need to be thinking about, once again, very deliberately? So culture, I think, is something that has to be a contribution from everybody who's part of the culture, but certainly having some indications and some specifics is a way of really kind of communicating to the world that this is our wonderful culture, and everybody is invited to contribute to this culture. So we have 6 of these elements that I think really do enable teams to thrive.
Oh, fantastic. And I suppose that gives you that sense of identity, if you like, the identity of the people, the organisation, and perhaps then that sense of belonging, of why you're a part of that team, that organisation, that community. Fascinating. And so communication is obviously crucial in virtually everything, and definitely for community success. So how, if you were to advise community organisers perhaps on, how can community organisers maybe facilitate communication channels and strategies that align with the principles of the social brain?
Well, once again, it comes back to just how much we can absorb, how many relationships we can really tolerate. So there's a kind of tolerance level to how much communication you can be part of. We've just done a piece of research with our Gen Zs, who, as you know, are completely sort of vilified in the media for not wanting to work and, opting out. But of course, that's not really true. They are more the canaries in the cage to say, it's really difficult to tolerate organizations that just kind of endlessly bombard us with information that, we're part of something, but we don't understand how it connects to a broader purpose. So I think communication has to be really, really well thought through. The danger, I think, at the moment is just having too much going on. We've got Slack channels, we've got Teams. I mean, I don't know what your day is like, but there are 1,000 pinging messages at any given time from so many different channels. Email used to be the scourge. I think we've moved into a completely new universe, which is exponentially larger than email. But what is the impact on people? One of our colleagues has just recently had a third baby and has said, I cannot be on call after 6 p.m. because I'm just realizing, it's so compelling to respond to comms, especially if it's from people who are clients or seniors. So, how do we put these guardrails in place to make sure that it's meaningful, that you're responding to meaningful communication? So I don't necessarily have any brilliant advice, but I think my advice is especially when you're in a position of power or authority, or you're a leader, people take what you say super seriously. They won't know you if you're leading a large organization. They can't know you, but they will project their hopes and fears on you as a leader. So thinking about being choiceful about the words that you use, being choiceful about tone. I would like to see a friendlier, more human tone coming in communication. I think we're just all of us trying to get through our working week. I mean, kindness is absolutely the thing. If we could just be kinder and more sensitive to how people are dealing with their days, I think that would make a huge difference in communication. So certainly tone-wise, I'm all for a humankind tone. In terms of quantity, I'm all for, as a leader, be really conscious of how much communication you're sending out there and through all these multiple channels. Imagine the person on the receiving end, how exhausting it is for them. And then they have to kind of sift through what's helpful and what's not helpful at all. And probably less is more, perhaps. I mean, I'm saying this as a person who myself can over-communicate. So I'm actually giving myself my own wise words. But yeah, so I think that would be, we write a lot about communication, specifically around tone, actually, in our book, and just how important it is. And I think if ever there was a moment to be more human, now is it, I would say.
And just on that point, just something that kind of flashed into my mind there as we're having this conversation. And you say, you talk about tone in the book and communication. And I don't know if anybody else finds this, but I find it more and more difficult now for people to pick up the phone and talk to somebody than send an email. And the difference in having either a face-to-face conversation or a telephone conversation, in that tone of, what you were trying to convey is vastly different to sending an email. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Oh, I mean, Craig, you are speaking to the choir, because I think this is the downside perhaps of hybrid working, is that we do then revert to the written word, which can be misinterpreted. Whereas I think when people are in an office together, being able to have a quick conversation, and we know this from all the research, incidental learning happens when you can walk past someone's desk and say, oh, what are you working on? And you can have a conversation, which doesn't really come out when you are having to do it all over a sort of, all over written comms. So absolutely think that, there is a real reeling back to an old school approach, which is, as you say, a telephone call or perhaps even a face-to-face. And we know that it's much more effective having eye contact with somebody. It's a miracle that we're sitting here in various different places in the world and having a virtual conversation, but actually having eye contact in a room with somebody, that's impossible to replicate in a virtual setting. So I'm 1,000% agreeing with you. I think that the more we can encourage people to come together and to have these more meaningful conversations, I think it ticks so many boxes. And actually, people enjoy it more. Mm-hmm. People enjoy conversations. People are drawn to watching and engaging with other people. And that is what makes us uniquely human, I think. So, yeah, if ever there was a need to come back into the office, I think it's to have those incidental opportunities for learning and for just really meeting other people who might not have had the opportunity. I think the stultifying effect of setting up a 30-minute team meeting and then expecting something that is really off the agenda to occur, I think it just doesn't happen in the way that we'd want it to. So, and we do have some interesting research to back that up in our book as well, actually. So completely agree.
Oh, I'm so glad it's not only me.
No, definitely not.
And just on that conversation, that communication, and then reflecting on bringing everybody into that conversation, if you like. One of the big elements we've looked at in our community over the past 2 years now is driving forward is that diversity and inclusivity piece to ensure that, how can we emphasize that in our communities? How can we ensure that everybody has a voice and that we're engaging everybody? We're in a technology environment which, if we look at one part of kind of diversity, is very male dominated. So, how do we bring more women into that environment and drive their comfort to being involved and engaging more in those communities? So if we look at diversity and inclusivity, how can kind of community leaders or business leaders leverage the social brains insights to create that inclusive environment?
Well, that's such a fantastic question, because I think that, we talk about the constraints of how many relationships we can have and the trade-offs and our kind of move or yen for homophily, which is a sort of birds of a feather effect. It's just kind of easier, simpler, cognitively less demanding. However, that's not an excuse at all. In fact, we have to work against the grain in that regard. It's just lazy leadership to kind of just stay within our small groups that we find comfortable. The role of a leader actually is to do exactly what you're describing. How do we create environments in which everybody can contribute? We use the word belonging a lot in our book. And we've interviewed Owen Eastwood, who wrote a book actually called Belonging, and really worth reading. And he's done some fantastic talks on his ideas around belonging. But it's this idea that at any moment in an organization is that every person should feel that they're there, they've been part of this organization because of the unique gifts they bring. So if we had to do something really simple to begin the process of everyone feeling included and feeling a sense of belonging, it would be to remind people why they are part of an organization. And it's stating the obvious, because you kind of think, well, yeah, we recruited them in and we've given them a welcome letter or pack or whatever. But actually, it's the responsibility of leaders to really be mindful of, once again, tone. It's a reminder that actually you're here because you are playing this absolutely critical part. And Owen uses fantastic examples of why this is such a powerful mechanism. The idea of belonging is that everybody needs to feel that they belong, and it's a feeling. It's a real sense of, actually, if I wasn't here, the organization would be worse off without me. How can you create an environment in which people really feel that? So we've just done a wonderful piece of work, actually, where we've asked teams to think about how they create as a team a real sense of belonging for every single person, really recognizing that there are these constraints which include time, task focus, busyness, but that's not an excuse. How can you as a team leader and as a team really think about creating this feeling of belonging for everybody? And once again, it is not about people just complying to the most dominant voice. It's about people feeling comfortable to share what's on their mind. And diversity has wonderful gifts to give to organizations who take it seriously, and not done in a superficial way. This needs to be done with heart and real caring and acknowledgement that every person is there because they are bringing something unique to the organization or to the team. So I think the intent has to be absolutely, has to be true to the purpose, actually, of what needs to be done. But that is a fantastic question. Yeah, it's really important.
Thank you. And, we talked about leadership, about how kind of we can bring diverse voices into a community, into an organisation, create that sense of belonging. And one of the key elements that we look at in our community is obtaining feedback on, how are we doing? Because one of the key things that I believe is that as everything evolves, whether it's an organisation, a community within that organisation, or a community itself, that continuous improvement is essential. We've got to keep moving forward. We can't stay still. I think there was a comment in the book called negative drift, that explorers
yes.
get when the ice is moving the opposite direction to what the sled wants to go. But we've got to keep moving forward. And do you have any insights you could share with us from how can feedback from community members, employees, etc., be effectively gathered and utilised to ensure that we're adapting to their changing needs and preferences?
Yeah, well, once again, also a fantastic challenge, because I think feedback can come in two forms. It can come in the sort of tick the box process form, often connected to a number and not very thoughtful, or it can come in with a really reflective aspect. And what I mean by that, Craig, is the idea that it should benefit both parties. So there's something of a reflective practice where people have an opportunity to think through things in a careful way that is both, it's beneficial to the person who's giving the feedback, and obviously giving it, and the organization who can benefit from the insights. So what do I mean by reflective? I have, and it's taken me years to get here actually, is in my early days, I was very much a fan of the kind of quantitative, on a scale of 1 to 5, because it's kind of an easy thing to do. But as I've thought about feedback more, I think there are two aspects to it. The one is, how can we ask really good questions that really make you think, so that the person, there's a little bit of jeopardy in for the person who's responding to that, so that they actually do have to take the time out and be thoughtful about it, because it's a kind of mutual benefit. So there's that pay, and I think qualitative feedback offers that a little bit more than quantitative feedback. And then the other thing is, how do you convey an intent that is really about getting honest feedback? Because I sometimes worry that that people kind of hold back. They're worried about the consequences. And certainly anyone who's ever filled in an employee engagement survey will recognize in themselves this kind of worry that if they put their name, there might be some kind of consequence down the line. But actually, how do you encourage really honest feedback? So I think feedback is an art. There's a bit of science to it, and perhaps I was more oriented to the science back in the days, but I'm now more focused on the art. Is brilliant questions, absolutely honest intent, and a real encouragement for thoughtfulness and honesty. So if we can get that, I think that is beneficial to both parties. I think it's a two-way street.
Oh, thank you. And as we come towards the end of our discussion, if you had one piece of advice to share with our listeners on how they can make their communities and organisations are involved with a success, what would it be?
It would be to have a social strategy, which is as important as any other strategy that you have. I mean, organisations have got marketing strategies, finance strategies, sales strategies, but actually we're all people. Organizations are clusters of social groups. The social life of an organization is what gives it the magic. It's what gives it the energy, the idea that people want to come to work because they're absolutely passionate about the organization. They want to give, it's so tied into performance, impact, and innovation. My encouragement is that every leader, every person in an organization really is thoughtful about a social strategy. How do we design our organization to maximize the benefit of having all these people coming together? That is our human gift. How do we leverage and utilize that? So thinking about a finance strategy, we know how to do that. Thinking about a social strategy, that's a whole new area, but super exciting. And I think that's really where the benefits will be felt, actually, of implementing the practices from the social brain.
Fantastic. Thank you. Samantha, thank you so much for spending time with me today and for sharing your insights. And yeah, thank you. And
thank you, Craig.
To our listeners, thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation and found it valuable. Please make sure you do subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And you can also pick up a copy of The Social Brain, The Psychology of Successful Groups, from all good booksellers. So please, I can tell you it's a fantastic read. Please do pick it up. And until the next time, stay safe, stay well, and be social.